everybody. If you could use some extra practice at the basics of defining classes, here are some tips. So first, you should read the description of how the object is intended to be used, using our voting machine example from class. Your goal is going to be to write the method stubs, which is figuring out what methods does your object need to have, and what inputs do they take, and what should they do. But you're not going to actually implement the body of the method. You're not going to worry about how they work yet. You're just focusing on what needs to happen. So if I'm reading over this description, a couple of things pop out at me. I see the constructor, and you can know it's the constructor because of the keyword new. It's also the same name as the data type, voting machine. I see cast vote, I see get total votes for, and I see get winner. So the next thing to notice is what inputs each one expects. So here I see the constructor expects a single integer as input. And I'm thinking, well, what does that mean? If you read the comments, it'll usually tell you how to interpret the input to every method. So using that, you're going to write an outline for your class. It always starts with public class and then the name of your class. You're going to leave space up here at the top because that's where your private variables are going to go. Then you have your constructor. The constructor has the same name as the class. It has no return type, not even void. That part's just blank. And then the parameter here, the input variable, has to match whatever type of value is being given when the constructors run. Same thing for the other methods. So cast vote takes a single integer as input, and I can see that that 0 is going to get assigned to this variable here that I created. Get winner, notice there's no input at all, and so get winner doesn't need a variable to take an input. So the next step is to clearly imagine what is going to happen inside this object as it's being run. Because each method is supposed to do something to the object's variables, or with the object's variables. I've removed the comments that say what's happening, but the idea is we're going to create a voting machine that tracks the votes for 5 candidates. And then we're going to vote for candidate 0, and then 4, and then 5, and then 3. And then we're going to ask, how many total votes did candidate 3 get? So if I'm imagining, as a human being, if I was going to do the things that my object is supposed to do, what information would I need to keep track of? And what would be a good way to organize it? The answers to those questions are going to tell you what variables, what attributes your object needs. For individual variables, you've got the familiar options. You've got string and int and double and boolean and others if you know them. You could also make arrays of those variables or array lists of those variables. And in the future, there are going to be other options as well. Remember, an array is good if you know exactly how long your array needs to be in advance, and you know that the size never needs to change as your object's running. An array list would be good if you need to be able to expand or retract your list, be able to add and remove things as the methods are getting run, like grow and shrink it. So here, I've decided to make an int array. I've marked it private so that the object protects it from being interfered with and having its values changed from outside the class. Remember, you only declare your variables at the top of the class. You actually give them their starting values in the constructor because that's the job of the constructor. I chose an int array because for this particular voting machine, the number of candidates is given right when we create the machine. And I know I'm never going to need to be able to track votes for more candidates than that. So it's okay for me to create an array that's fixed size. Usually, the other methods are going to be using that object's variables in some way. So cast vote, the idea is I'm going to say which candidate I want to cast a vote for. And what needs to happen is I need to add 1 for whichever integer variable up here is responsible for keeping track of the number of votes for that candidate. So here I'm using the candidate number as the location number, as the index into my array. And so I'm saying let's go to the integer variable that's at this location and add 1 to it as a way of recording the fact that we're casting a vote for a new candidate. So that's the idea. Your methods are going to enable somebody from outside your object to tell it to do something. And the way that it's going to do it usually is by either changing or looking at its own variables, because its own variables are keeping track of all the important information that it's responsible for. This is less an issue on the AP test, but in actual programming, you also want to be careful to check for possibly invalid inputs. So in the previous slide, I wouldn't have wanted to just access the location for a candidate that was -1, because we don't have a candidate -1. That would have crashed the program because it would have accessed an invalid array index. So instead, to make it safe, I can check the input and say only if it's between 0 and the length of my array, then it's safe to actually try and add 1. Okay, so here are the steps. One more time. You're going to read the description for how the object's going to be used, carefully note what methods exist and what inputs they expect, and then you're going to write the template for your class with method stubs. Then you're going to imagine, as the object's running, what information does it need to be able to keep track of, and how are you going to organize that into variables. And those are going to become your private attributes, your private variables at the top of your class. Finally, you're going to implement each method by thinking about how does what that method is supposed to do need to use the object's variables. And finally, you're going to consider, would it be possible for somebody to give an input that would in some way break the program, or in some way make the values of our variables become nonsensical or inaccurate. Okay, so this is a practice problem. It's an easier problem than the ones at the AP level, but I think it's a good practice problem for just practicing those steps, especially if in your mind you don't have like the template of a class. You'll probably need, if you don't have the template of a class in your mind, you'll probably need to practice with more than one example. But this is a good starter one. So go ahead, read this problem over, think about the steps. On a piece of paper, instead of in your IDE, go ahead and try and write a complete class definition for a class representing a beam balance.